Welcome once again to the Brownstone, Wolfe's sanctuary of logic, orchids, and murder. Do tell us where in the world you're listening from, and don't hesitate to share your thoughts. If you enjoy these cases, consider liking and subscribing. Now then, shall we begin? Nero Wolfe and the Heiress of Charleston. It was 12 minutes past midnight, and I was finishing a glass of milk at Wolfe's desk, trying to decide whether it was worth the trouble to head upstairs and wrestle with the bed springs when the phone rang. In Wolfe's house, phones that ring at that hour don't carry cheerful voices checking in about Aunt Sally's appendectomy or reminders about tomorrow's butcher delivery. No, they announced trouble. Corpse-shaped, criminal-shaped, or Inspector Kramer-shaped. I wasn't betting on the milkman. The bell's jangle was insistent, too long for an accidental lift and drop of the receiver. I gave my milk a regretful salute. It was just settling into that perfect icy lull, and grabbed the phone. North 35th Street residence, I said, crisp enough to suggest wide-awake virtue. The voice that came through wasn't Kramer's growl, which eliminated one category of grief, but it wasn't exactly soothing either. It belonged to a young woman, southern by the sound, with vowels stretched like satin over pearls. The drawl was delicate but rushed, as if she were trying to outrun her own fear. "Please, Mr. Wolfe, is this the house of Nero Wolfe?" "It is," I said. "But you've got me, Archie Goodwin. The boss turns into a pumpkin at 11. He doesn't take calls at midnight unless you happen to be a corpse with a strong long-distance plan." That earned no laugh, which was disappointing but not surprising. Her breath came in short bursts. "I haven't much time. They're following me. I'm Caroline Ashford. My family's in Charleston, you may have heard." I hadn't, but I wasn't going to hurt her feelings. "Let's say I have. Where exactly are you, Miss Ashford?" A hiss of static filled the line, and then her voice dropped lower, almost conspiratorial. "The family trust, the ledger, they'll kill me if—" A loud scrape like the receiver banging a surface cut her off. Then a muffled shout in the background, male and angry. Her voice flared back in panic. "Tell him, tell Mr. Wolfe, they know about the ledger." The line went dead. I jiggled the hook a few times, but nothing came back except the operator asking if I wanted to place a call. I didn't. I hung up and stared at the phone like it had just sprouted fangs. Behind me came the unmistakable throat clearing of a man dragged unwillingly from Morpheus. I turned. There was Wolfe in the doorway, the picture of dignity in decline. He wore his brown silk robe tied once across the equator of his belly, and slippers that had never seen more than carpet. His hair stuck up at angles, as if even gravity hesitated at midnight. He regarded me with a mixture of annoyance and suspicion, like a man catching his cook boiling beer. "Archie," he said, voice heavy as a sermon, "who was it?" "Your guess is as good as mine," I told him. "But mine has a southern accent, pearls in her throat, and a talent for dramatic exits. She claimed to be Caroline Ashford of Charleston. Does that ring a Liberty Bell?" He crossed to the red leather chair, lowering himself as if the chair might collapse in protest. He folded his hands on his middle. "Ashford, Charleston, cotton, shipping, an old family, burdened by its own myths." "You read too many genealogies." "Pfui, I read history. Now recount." So I did, while he watched me with the kind of patience that made you want to leave out a detail just to see if he'd twitch. I included every breath and static burst down to her last word. "Ledger." When I finished, he pursed his lips. "A ledger? Of what?" "That's the $64 question. My hunch. Not hymnals." She said family trust. If it's anything like the families I know, that ledger could list missing millions or who kissed whose cousin behind the cotton gin. "Archie," Wolfe rumbled, "contain your levity. This is no jest. A woman does not call at midnight to trifle. She is either imperiled or contriving." "Take your pick," I said. Either way, she sounded scared enough to rattle glass. And then the shout in the background. If it wasn't stage work, she's got company with rough manners. He reached for the bell cord by his desk and gave it a short tug. A minute later, Fritz appeared in his nightshirt, blinking like an owl dragged into daylight. "Beer," Wolfe said. Fritz glanced at me with a look that suggested I should reconsider my life choices. Midnight beer requests weren't in the manual, but he bowed and vanished. "You'll need the calories to think," I asked. "I require composure," Wolfe said, "and malt is its ally." "Meanwhile," I said, "there's a frantic heiress somewhere in Manhattan about to be strangled with her own pearls." He half closed his eyes, which on Wolfe was a form of sprinting. "Locate her, Archie, at once." "You mean now? At night? In the rain?" He opened his eyes. "Yes." That was Wolfe for you. He wouldn't leave the house if the Hudson itself rose to the stoop, but he had no qualms about sending me into the midnight drizzle after a shadow with a drawl. Fritz returned with the beer, poured into a chilled glass that misted instantly in the warm office air. Wolfe lifted it, sipped, and sighed as if confirming the world still spun. Then he gestured toward the hall. "Find her. Without her we are fumbling blind. With her we may yet perceive the shape of the ledger." I grabbed my hat and coat from the rack. "And if she's already been turned into a newspaper headline?" "Then," Wolfe said, "Inspector Kramer will appear with his cigar, and I will be vexed. Go." I went. The night air slapped me awake as soon as I stepped outside. Rain slicked the pavement, turning the brownstone stoop into a stage set from some cheap melodrama. The street lamps burned halos into the mist, and every parked car looked like it was waiting to tail me. I checked a couple of the usual hotel registers by phone, burning nickels and patience, but no Caroline Ashford had checked in under her own name. That didn't mean much. An heiress in trouble wouldn't sign Caroline Target Ashford at the desk. Still, it meant I was chasing fog. By 2 a.m., with no Caroline in sight, I dragged myself back to the brownstone. Wolfe was still in the office, glass empty, eyes closed, looking like a Roman emperor deciding whether to pardon or execute. "Well?" he demanded, opening one eye. "Nothing. Either she's hiding under a rock or someone put her there." He harumphed. "Then we wait. She will come." "And if she doesn't?" His eyes shut again. "She will. Trouble has a way of finding its way to my door, Archie. Always." That was the ritual closure right there. Wolfe had declared fate a house guest, and once he did that, the only thing left was to climb the stairs and hope sleep didn't come with a southern accent. The next morning at precisely 11 o'clock, the bell rang. That meant trouble, since 11 was orchid hour, and interrupting Wolfe among the blossoms was like heckling Toscanini mid-symphony. I was at my desk typing up last night's notes, more for Wolfe's files than for my amusement, when the chime sounded. I didn't jump. Bells don't surprise you in that house. They announce the next act in a long-running play. I buzzed the elevator, checked the peephole, and got my first look at Caroline Ashford. She had the kind of presence that made you forget she was 3 minutes late. Tall, veiled in black netting, her gloves perfectly matched to her tailored suit. She looked like she'd stepped out of a magazine spread titled Heiresses in Distress. Beside her was a man who radiated Southern law office from his pinstripes to his silver hair. His cane was polished mahogany, his manner the kind of genteel authority that suggested he'd won cases by quoting ancestors. "Miss Ashford, Mr. Bryce," I said, holding the door. "Welcome to the North 35th Street Asylum. The doctor is upstairs whispering sweet nothings to orchids. He'll be down when the flowers are finished with him." Caroline's gloved hand twitched. "But I told you last night." "Don't worry," I said. "He'll hear you out. He just won't hear you until he's good and ready. Park it in the office." They followed me in. The office was bathed in the kind of weak sunlight that barely penetrates Manhattan grime. Caroline lowered herself into the red leather chair opposite Wolfe's, posture perfect, but I saw the tremor in her fingers when she removed her veil. Her face was oval, striking in that Southern Belle way, pale, poised, with eyes that carried both breeding and sleeplessness. Bryce settled on the couch with a sigh, placing his cane across his knees. He gave me the look lawyers reserve for jurors who might not appreciate Latin. "Mr. Goodwin, I hope you understand the gravity of our visit. This is not light-hearted, no kidding." I leaned against the desk. "I caught that from her midnight aria, but you'll want to save the big words for Wolfe." At 11:25 sharp, the elevator purred, and Wolfe entered like a monarch descending from Olympus. His orchid room robe had been traded for his yellow silk house jacket, a pocket square like a surrender flag in the breast. He lowered himself into his chair, adjusted his cuffs, and gave them the look, half boredom, half courtroom. "Miss Ashford, Mr. Bryce, Nathaniel Bryce, attorney at law." The voice was measured molasses. "I represent Miss Ashford's interests, such as they remain." "Indeed." Wolfe steepled his fingers. "You have come because of last night's call. You were incoherent, Miss Ashford. Clarify." She drew a breath. My father, Charles Ashford, passed away 6 months ago. He was wealthy. Our fortune rests in shipping, cotton, real estate. He placed it all in a family trust. But since his death, control has been contested. My cousin Gerald insists the trust should fall to him. He's been pressing me to renounce my claim. Pressing how? Wolfe's voice was precise enough to cut paper. Her gaze dropped to her gloves. First with persuasion, then threats. Yesterday morning at my hotel, I found this. She drew a folded sheet from her purse and handed it across. I took it, unfolded it, and whistled low. Typed on cheap bond, just one line. The ledger decides, and so do we. Signed simply, The Ledger. Wolfe read it without touching, as if his glance alone could file it. The Ledger. Caroline nodded. It's the name whispered in my family like a curse. My father kept a private ledger, records of investments, transactions, perhaps indiscretions. None of us has ever seen it. Gerald insists it will prove I am unfit to inherit. Others claim it contains evidence that would ruin us all. Pfui, Wolfe tapped the arm of his chair. You say this ledger exists. You have not seen it. Yet you tremble at a note typed on pulp. Why? Her voice hardened. Because last night someone tried to follow me from the St. Regis to a cab. If not for the doorman's intervention, I think... She stopped. Bryce leaned forward. Mr. Wolfe, Miss Ashford has reason to believe her cousin Gerald intends to remove her as an obstacle. Permanently. That is why we are here. I gave Wolfe a sideways look. He returned it with a lift of his brows. You see? He leaned back. Very well. Terms. Terms, Caroline repeated. My services, Wolfe said, are not tendered lightly. The retainer is $20,000, payable forthwith. Honesty is requisite. Deception voids all agreement, and you will submit entirely to my direction. That jolted her upright. 20? But Bryce was already drawing a checkbook from his breast pocket. He scribbled, tore, and placed the slip on Wolfe's desk. A cashier's check, as requested. We anticipated your custom. Wolfe's lips twitched, not quite a smile. Satisfactory. He rang the bell cord. Fritz arrived, immaculate as ever despite the early hour, bearing a tray of coffee and buttered rolls. He poured with silent grace. Caroline accepted hers with both hands like it might steady her. Bryce declined. Wolfe sipped, set his cup down, and fixed her with the full artillery of his gaze. Now, Miss Ashford, you will tell me everything. Names, motives, incidents. Spare nothing. For the next half hour she spoke, voice steadier as the coffee worked. Gerald, charming but reckless, addicted to cards and champagne. Eugenia Ashford, the matriarch, outwardly genteel but with a tongue like a whip. Business allies who circled like vultures around shipping contracts. And always the whispered mention of the ledger, said to contain the truth of the family's rise and sins. Wolfe interrupted only once, to ask dates and figures. I jotted notes in shorthand, though I could have sketched the whole scene in oil paint. Heiress against tyrant, ledger against lie. When she finished, Wolfe closed his eyes. Silence thickened until the clock chimed noon. He opened them again. Very well. I accept the engagement, but understand me, Miss Ashford, you must be candid. If you attempt to conceal or contrive, I shall terminate this arrangement instantly. Her lips pressed thin. I understand. Good. Wolfe shifted. Archie will verify the threat at your hotel, consult with Inspector Kramer regarding these allegations, and ascertain Gerald Ashford's present circumstances. You will remain available hereafter. Leave your address and number with Mr. Goodwin. Bryce rose, tapping his cane once. We are obliged, sir. Caroline gathered her veil. As they reached the door, she paused, eyes catching mine. There was fear there, yes, but also steel, the kind that comes from years of family battle. Mr. Goodwin, she said softly, I didn't imagine the North could feel so dangerous. Thank you for answering last night. I gave her my best grin. It's what I do. Milk at midnight, doorbells at dawn, all part of the service. The door shut behind them. Wolfe grunted. Family fortunes, feuds, ledgers, the oldest poisons in civilization. I slid the check into the safe, locked it, and turned. Sure, but 20,000 makes the taste sweeter. He reached for his cup. Archie, get Inspector Kramer, now. That was my cue. Trouble had paid its retainer, and the meter was running. By the time Wolfe finished his 1 o'clock lunch, beef roulade with mushroom sauce, and Fritz had slipped me a slice on the side, I had my marching orders: trail Gerald Ashford, cousin and contender for the Ashford Trust, and see whether he perspired guilt or just bourbon. I caught Gerald at 3 o'clock coming out of his Wall Street office, a place with more glass and polish than work. He was tall, square-jawed, and had that slicked hair confidence that usually comes from never having earned anything the hard way. His suit was blue worsted, too sharp for a Tuesday, and the handkerchief in his pocket had a crease you could slice bread with. If Caroline looked like southern steel wrapped in velvet, Gerald was southern charm dipped in arsenic. I let him get half a block ahead, then fell in behind, giving the windows enough reflection to check my tail. He didn't hurry. He strolled, tipping his hat to secretaries, whistling under his breath, a man without worries, or a man hiding them under a grin. At 4, he ducked into a smoky uptown club, the kind where the carpet's thick but the air's thicker, the Magnolia Club. I paid my dues at the door with a smile and a borrowed line about meeting a client. Inside, it was all brass lamps and mahogany, with portraits of Confederate generals leering down at gamblers who weren't born when the South fell. Gerald headed straight for a booth at the back. I took a chair at the bar, ordered milk. Yes, milk. The bartender looked at me like I'd just kicked a bulldog, and angled my ears. The man across from Gerald was a broker I'd seen before at police lineups of shady characters. Thin lips, eyes like pennies underwater, reeking of quick deals and quicker disappearances. Their voices carried, thanks to the hush of money being lost at cards. "Been locked up too long," Gerald muttered. His hand slammed the table. "If the old man's ledger comes out, it ruins me. It ruins all of us." The broker leaned in. "Then you'd better get it before someone else does, or you'll be watching Caroline take the whole pot." Gerald's jaw tightened. "Caroline won't live to inherit. She doesn't understand the game." That set my ears burning. He said it with enough coldness to chill the ice in his glass. I took another sip of milk to keep my expression neutral, but it tasted like chalk. I turned slightly, and that's when Gerald spotted me in the mirror behind the bar. Our eyes met for half a second. He smiled, thin and knowing, and leaned back. A minute later, a gorilla in a brown suit detached himself from a corner table. He had the subtlety of a wrecking ball and a face like a busted radiator. He came toward me, rolling his shoulders. "Buddy," he said, clapping a paw on mine, "Mr. Ashford don't like shadows." "Tell him I prefer daylight," I said. He squeezed my arm. The pressure could have cracked walnuts. "Step outside." We did, into an alley that smelled like stale beer and bad choices. He swung first, a haymaker big enough to knock out a street lamp. I ducked, jabbed his middle, and he folded halfway. But he had reach, and his next swing caught me on the cheek. Stars went off like Broadway. I went low, shoved him against the wall, and drove a knee into his gut. He gasped, bent double, and I clipped his jaw for good measure. He sagged but didn't drop. That was enough for me. I dusted my lapel and gave him a smile. "Tell Mr. Ashford next time he wants to chat, he can buy me a drink. Milk, straight up." He spat blood and growled something unprintable. I left him to it. Back at the brownstone at 6 on the dot, Wolfe descended from the orchid rooms smelling faintly of fertilizer and disapproval. He took one look at my bruised jaw and scowled. "Archie, explain." So I did. The Magnolia Club, the broker, Gerald's little speech about Caroline not living to inherit, and the alley rendezvous. Wolfe listened with his eyes closed, fingers drumming his belly like a funeral march. When I finished, he opened them and said, "Phooey, a cousin who declares his cousin's impending demise is either foolish or reckless, perhaps both." "He meant it," I said, cold as ice, "and that broker wasn't selling Girl Scout cookies. Something's brewing around that ledger." Wolfe tilted his head. "A ledger which no one admits to having seen, yet which inspires threats and assaults. The human race is incurably credulous. Still," he shifted, reached for the bell cord and tugged. "Fritz, beer." As Fritz brought the tray, I rubbed my jaw and added, "For what it's worth, Gerald's got more bluff than poker chips. But if he's just putting on an act, he deserves an Oscar." Wolfe took the beer, savoured it, and set it down. "Archie, prepare a memorandum of today's observations. We may need to present it to Inspector Kramer. He will be exasperated, but he must be warned that a woman's life may hang by a thread. I rolled a fresh sheet into the typewriter. You know, I'd like to see Kramer's face when I tell him an heiress is about to be snuffed out by her cousin over a ledger that may or may not exist. He'll choke on his cigar. Do not jest, Wolfe intoned. Print and precisely. Leave no room for ridicule. That was Wolfe's ritual closure. Beer for him, paperwork for me, and bruises for the file. If Caroline Ashford was the steel underneath the velvet, her cousin Gerald was the blade sharpening for her throat. And me? I was the guy stuck in the middle with milk curdling in my stomach and a typewriter waiting for facts Kramer wouldn't want to hear. It was 7 minutes past 8 when I stepped into the lobby of the St. Regis. If you've never been there, it's the kind of place where the carpets are so thick you feel guilty for walking on them, and the chandeliers look like they should come with their own insurance policies. The clerks behind the desk gave me the once-over, decided my suit was a half-notch below the clientele, and filed me under unwelcome but tolerable. Caroline Ashford had phoned earlier, asking Wolfe to meet her at her suite. Wolfe, being Wolfe, informed her orchids and dinner took precedence over heiresses in distress. So naturally, I got the field assignment. The elevator purred me to the 10th floor, and the hall smelled of expensive perfume, fighting a losing battle with city air. I knocked twice on her door. Silence. Another knock, and nothing but the hum of electricity. My hackles rose, the kind of silence that fills a room before a body does. I tried the knob. Unlocked. That was the first wrong note in the symphony. I stepped inside. The suite was dim, curtains half-drawn, lamps still unlit. Somebody had left a champagne bucket sweating on the table, one glass used, the other untouched. A silk scarf trailed off the sofa like it had been dropped mid-flight. I called her name once. Nothing. I crossed to the bedroom. That's where the music hit its crescendo. Nathaniel Bryce, attorney at law and silver-haired guardian of Southern fortunes, was on the carpet. Flat. His shirt front was blooming red around a silver letter opener buried to the hilt. The Ashford crest gleamed on the handle like a family signature on a death warrant. His eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling with the sort of expression that made cross-examination unnecessary. I crouched, careful not to touch. The room smelled of iron and perfume. Beside the bed, a small purse sat open. I recognized it as Caroline's. Inside, powder compact, lipstick, a folded half-note charred along the edges. I eased it open. Typed words, scorched but legible. We'll end this. The ledger decides. The rest was ash. Before I could file that away in memory, the sound of authority arrived. Fists pounding the door, voices barking. A second later, Inspector Kramer and 2 uniforms barged in. He had a cigar jammed in his teeth, his eyes already boiling. He saw Bryce and let out something between a curse and a growl. "Goodwin! Damn it, I should have known. What the hell is this?" I straightened. "Evening, Inspector. You're just in time for the main course. Bryce, carved with family silver. Caroline's missing." "Missing? Don't hand me that. Where is she?" If I knew, I'd have her gift wrapped. All I found was him, her handbag, and this little souvenir. I held up the half-burned note by the corner. Kramer snatched it, squinting through cigar smoke. "The ledger again. You playing games, Goodwin?" "I don't invent Southern melodrama. I just trip over it." Stebbins came in behind him, bulldog face sourer than usual. He grunted. "No forced entry." She let him in. Then she stuck him. "Hold it," I said. Bryce wasn't the kind to ogle his clients or blackmail them. He was her protector. If she wanted him dead, she could have just fired him and saved the dry cleaning bill. Kramer puffed smoke. "You're too damn glib. She called Wolfe, asked you here, and now her lawyer's cooling off with her monogrammed cutlery in his chest. Where is she?" I shrugged. "Ask the walls. They're as talkative as I am." Kramer looked about, ready to explode. The uniforms started combing the suite, snapping photos, bagging the obvious. One of them lifted the champagne bottle. "Cheap stuff," he muttered. It smelled wrong for a St. Regis suite. If it wasn't planted, it was peculiar enough to note maybe to suggest a tryst gone wrong. Kramer rounded on me. "Goodwin, you phone your boss, now. I want his version before I drag him in myself." So I dialed the brownstone. Fritz answered in his usual soft voice. I asked for Wolfe, and in a moment the heavy tones rolled down the line. "Well, Archie?" Wolfe demanded. I gave him the blow-by-blow. The suite, the silence, Bryce on the carpet with family silver, Caroline absent, the handbag, the burned note. I left out nothing. Wolfe never forgave economy in reporting. On the other end, I heard his exhale, long and controlled. So, she vanishes, leaving behind her protector dead and a token of menace. Kramer, I assume, is there. Foaming at the mouth, I said, and aiming the nozzle straight at Caroline. Phooey, his voice sharpened. The woman is foolish, perhaps, but not homicidal. Archie, note carefully. The purse left behind suggests haste or coercion, not guilt. If she intended to flee, she would have taken her resources. Describe the note, precisely. I did, word for word, scorch marks included. Then it is consistent. This ledger is not a phantom. Someone wields it to manipulate perception, perhaps to conceal their own depredations. Remain observant. I will not move from here. Big surprise, I muttered. Archie. His tone was the gavel falling. Do not jest. Report in full upon your return. And Archie, be careful. This is a web of wealth and venom. You may be the fly. The line clicked dead. Kramer was glaring at me. What did your boss say? That the purse proves she ran in a hurry, not with a plan, and that you should stop barking up the wrong magnolia tree. His face went purple. If Wolfe thinks he can run this case from that damn armchair, he's got another thing coming. I'll have a warrant on him so fast. Inspector, Stebbins interrupted, holding up the letter opener in a bag. Initials on the handle matched the old man's set. Definitely Ashford property. Kramer swore again, cigar bobbing. So she stabs her own lawyer with her daddy's silver. Hell, that's open and shut. Or open and staged, I said. You ever think Gerald might benefit from framing his cousin? He's got motive by the barrel. Kramer jabbed his cigar at me. Don't play lawyer, Goodwin. You tell Wolfe to stop shielding her, or I'll drag the both of you in. He stormed out, uniforms on his heels, Stebbins lugging evidence like it was dog chow. The suite emptied, leaving me with Bryce's stare and the echo of Wolfe's words. Luxury had its masks all right. Behind silk curtains and champagne, blood had written its own entry in the ledger. I gave the place one last sweep. No Caroline, just the smell of money, perfume, and murder. I pulled the door shut behind me and headed into the night, bruised jaw aching, coat collar up against the drizzle. It wasn't over. Wolfe was waiting, orchids humming, beer chilling, and his brain already setting the next trap. At 9:30 the next morning, the brownstone was quiet except for the scratch of my typewriter. I was putting together a neat memorandum of last night's soiree at the St. Regis, which had climaxed with Nathaniel Bryce dead on the carpet, and Caroline vanished. Wolfe wanted everything typed while it was fresh. That was his way of saying, Archie, earn your salary while I digest Fritz's eggs. The bell rang at precisely 9:52, and I knew before I opened the door it would not be a milkman. Sure enough, Inspector Kramer charged in like a battleship that had missed its target and was looking for something to ram. He had his cigar jammed between his teeth, smoke billowing like a signal flare, and a crumpled paper bag in one fist. Behind him lumbered Pearly Stebbins, bulldog face set in its usual permanent growl. "Where is he?" Kramer barked. "In the plant room," I said sweetly. 9 to 11, remember? Orchids before felonies. He'll be down at the stroke of 11, provided you don't stroke out first. Kramer didn't like it, but he knew the rules. He stomped into the office, dropped into a chair, and glared at me while smoke filled the room. At 10:59, Wolfe's elevator hummed. A moment later he entered, yellow silk house jacket immaculate, lips compressed at the intrusion. He lowered himself into his chair with a grunt. "Inspector!" His voice was as formal as a courtroom clerk's. "You have come early. Orchids are not to be disturbed." "Damn your orchids," Kramer snapped. He slapped the bag on the desk and pulled out the half-burned note I'd handed him last night. "You recognize this?" "I recognize Archie's description of it," Wolfe said coolly. "Typed, scorched, signed, the ledger. It is consistent." "Consistent with murder." Kramer's cigar bobbed dangerously. "Your heiress client runs, her lawyer winds up dead, and we find this in her hotel room. You're hiding her, Wolfe. Where is she?" "Phooey." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "You accuse without evidence. If Miss Ashford were here, you would have seen her on your way in." Kramer leaned forward, smoke curling from his nostrils. "Don't toy with me. She called you, begged for help, then disappears right after a killing. That's motive, means, and opportunity. If I thought you were sheltering her, I'd have you dragged to Centre Street and squeezed till you popped. I couldn't resist. Inspector, the only thing that pops in this office is Fritz's popovers at lunch. Maybe you should stay. Kramer glared at me. Shut up, Goodwin. Wolfe shifted, planting his hands on the chair arms like a judge preparing to render verdict. Inspector, I do not trifle with murder investigations. If Miss Ashford comes to me, I shall inform you. Meanwhile, your haste blinds you. A woman who flees without her handbag flees under duress, not intent. The inference is plain. Plain hogwash, Kramer shot back. At that moment, Stebbins cleared his throat like a diesel engine. Inspector, we got word on Gerald Ashford. He was at the Park Lane from 7 till midnight last night. Poker game with half a dozen witnesses. Rock-solid alibi. That was a neat little twist. Gerald, who had promised Caroline wouldn't live to inherit, now tucked safe behind playing cards and witnesses. I leaned back, whistled. So Gerald's cleared. That leaves Caroline holding the silverware, doesn't it? Kramer pounced. Exactly. She knifed her own lawyer and ran. It was a red herring served on a silver platter, but Wolfe wasn't biting. He folded his arms across his expanse and stared at the ceiling. Convenient, Inspector. Too convenient. A cousin openly threatens, then is quickly provided an alibi. A lawyer dedicated to protecting his client is struck down. You leap to accuse the woman most vulnerable. It is inelegant. Kramer flushed. Call it what you like. I call it evidence. Then you are a fool, Wolfe snapped, voice booming. The silence afterward was thick enough to spread on toast. I jumped in with a grin. Gentlemen, if you're going to duel, at least let me fetch the seconds. I'd suggest Fritz, but he's polishing cutlery. That broke the tension enough for Kramer to puff smoke instead of explode. Wolfe pulled the bell cord. Fritz arrived with the morning tray, coffee, buttered rolls, and a dish of marmalade. The incongruity of Wolfe calmly buttering bread while Kramer fumed could have fueled a one-act comedy. Wolfe chewed thoughtfully, then pronounced, Inspector, you will accomplish nothing by harassing me. The solution requires intellect, not bluster. Archie, you will recover the missing half of that note. The fire destroyed part, but the whole exists somewhere. Without it, we are crippled. I raised an eyebrow. Sure, just waltz into a crime scene past your pals here and ask politely for ashes. They'll love it. Use your ingenuity, Wolfe said firmly. The ledger speaks, but only in full voice. Kramer stubbed out his cigar with unnecessary force. You're obstructing, Wolfe. If you don't deliver that girl, I'll be back with a warrant. Wolfe dabbed his lips with a napkin. As you will. Good day, Inspector. That was dismissal, pure and simple. Kramer knew it, and his exit rattled the floorboards. Stebbins followed, muttering like distant thunder. The door shut, leaving only the smoke and Wolfe's calm chewing. I leaned back in my chair. So Gerald's covered, Caroline's the goat, and you want me to dig through ashes for the other half of a note. Anything else? Maybe fetch you the Holy Grail while I'm at it. Wolfe's eyes opened, glinting. Do not be flippant. Bring me the note. Then we may discern who profits by its menace. I sighed. Another day, another wild chase. But at least lunch was only an hour away. When Wolfe sent me back to the Magnolia Club, I skipped the tour. Same smoke, same portraits, same hush, and headed straight for the lounge. Whiskey decanters on oak sideboards, and a membership list full of Ashfords and their allies who thought the Mason-Dixon line was still a border. I arrived at 6, coat collar up against drizzle. The facade was brownstone elegance, gaslight lamps burning amber. Inside, the doorman looked me over like I was applying for a duel. I told him I was expected, and the kind of smile I used suggested that if he wanted to check the list, he'd be admitting he didn't know his own job. He swallowed, nodded, and let me through. The air inside was a blend of cigar smoke, bourbon, and old money. The carpet muffled footsteps, and a grand staircase swept upward under a chandelier that had seen more dusting than most fortunes. To the left was the reading room, to the right a lounge where waiters in white jackets hovered like loyal dogs. I spotted Gerald Ashford first, seated at a corner table with a man whose pinched expression screamed treasurer. Gerald leaned in, gesturing with a cigarette, his smile slick. I slid to the bar, ordered milk, earning the bartender's permanent enmity, and kept my ears open. Can't hold accounts forever, Gerald muttered, smoke curling. Closing them before the ledger resurfaces is the only way. Otherwise we're sunk. The treasurer whispered back, too low for me to catch. Gerald's jaw tightened. He stubbed his cigarette so hard the ashtray cracked. Whatever the subject, it wasn't friendly. Before I could inch closer, a voice regal and sharp cut through the haze. "Mr. Goodwin, isn't it?" I turned. Mrs. Eugenia Ashford, the matriarch, stood like she'd been carved from Charleston marble. Tall silver hair pinned with jeweled combs, pearls like cannonballs around her throat, and eyes that could slice a man thinner than Fritz's prosciutto. "Ma'am," I said, standing, "you've got me at a disadvantage." She smiled faintly. "Hardly. You are the shadow employed by Nero Wolfe. My grandson tells me you've been dogging his steps." "That's harsh," I said. "I prefer keeping him company from a distance." She gestured toward a settee. I followed, though it felt like being escorted to a firing squad. She lowered herself with poise, arranging gloves on her lap. "Mr. Goodwin, you must understand my family. We are complicated. Caroline is not well. She has always been impressionable, subject to fancies. These notes, this so-called ledger, I fear she has invented dangers where none exist." That was the red herring, laid out in pearls. I gave her my best listening face. "So, the midnight calls, the lawyer stabbed, her disappearance, those are just fancies." Her eyes glinted. "Grief makes women irrational. Caroline lost her father. She has become unsteady. I cannot condone slander against Gerald. He has his faults, yes, but he is no murderer." "Funny," I said lightly. "Last night he promised Caroline wouldn't live to inherit. Sounded pretty steady to me." Her lips pressed thin. "You misheard. My grandson is passionate, but not homicidal." I leaned closer. "And if this ledger exists, what then?" She didn't blink. "Then it should remain buried. Some histories do not belong in daylight." That was as close to a confession as I'd get in a club full of her allies. I excused myself, letting her pearls clink like shackles as I walked away. Gerald was gone from his booth by then. The treasurer sat alone, fussing with papers before tucking them into a folder. He rose and carried it toward the far wall, where a massive portrait of Robert E. Lee presided. He tapped a sequence on the frame, swung it forward, and revealed a steel safe the size of a coffin. Ledger-sized, you might say. In the mirror behind the bar, I caught his dial stops. 24, 79, 13, left, right, left. I filed them where I keep birthdays and grudges. I nursed my milk, pretending to admire the chandelier, but my eyes burned holes in that safe. The treasurer slipped the folder inside, spun the dial, and closed the general's face over it. Then he left, oblivious to my stare. It was the key clue, gleaming in brass and oil paint, the Ashford secrets guarded by a Confederate general in exile. I didn't push my luck. Magnolia wasn't the place for amateur theatrics. I let the room swallow me and strolled out into the night. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe was at his desk, a book on Byzantine logistics open but ignored. He raised his brows as I reported. "The matriarch thinks Caroline's nuts," I summarized. "Gerald's plotting with the treasurer about closing accounts. And behind Lee's portrait, they've got a safe big enough to hold the family skeletons, ledger included." Wolfe closed his eyes, fingers steepled. "Southern heritage as a weapon. They enshrine their sins behind portraits of their idols. Predictable." "Predictable or not," I said, "that safe is our next hurdle, and I'd bet Gerald's poker chips it holds the ledger." Wolfe tugged the bell cord. Fritz appeared with the evening tray. Beer for Wolfe, milk for me, buttered rolls to soften the gloom. "Archie," Wolfe said after sipping, "note this carefully. Eugenia Ashford denies murder, but not concealment. Gerald conspires with stewards of money. And the ledger, the phantom, is real enough to warrant a vault. You will contrive a way to inspect it." I groaned. "Sure. Just waltz into a Southern gentleman's club, borrow Robert E. Lee's portrait, and spin the dial. Easy as pie." He closed his eyes again. "Do not be flippant. Strategy, not jest. Report to me at midnight. Until then, avoid magnolias." That was Wolfe's ritual closure. Beer, command, and a dismissal sharp enough to clip wings. I raised my glass of milk. "To the Confederacy, then. May it fall twice," he grunted. That was as close as Wolfe got to applause. At 9 o'clock sharp the next morning, I climbed the stairs to Wolfe's orchid rooms. The boss had demanded my report before he descended for his session with Fritz's corned beef hash, and when Wolfe demands, You don't dawdle unless you enjoy explosions. The air in the plant rooms was a mix of damp earth and tropical perfume, thick enough to make you think you'd stumbled into a hothouse in Havana. Wolfe stood among the benches, enormous even in his loose brown smock, fingers gently adjusting a spray of Cattleya mossiae, like he was coaxing a queen to take a bow. Theodore Horstman hovered nearby, notebook in hand, looking worried about the humidity gauge. I cleared my throat. Wolfe didn't turn. "Well, Archie?" "I infiltrated the Magnolia Club, as instructed," I began. "Ordered milk at the bar, which scandalized the staff so much I may be blackballed already. Gerald was there, whispering with the club treasurer about closing accounts before the ledger resurfaces. Mrs. Eugenia Ashford also staged a cameo. Said Caroline's unstable, grief-stricken and prone to fancy, which is a polite way of calling her nuts. Oh, and there's a safe hidden behind Robert E. Lee's portrait in the lounge, big enough to hold family skeletons and a ledger." That got him to turn. His eyes glistened like a basilisk's. Behind a portrait of Lee, Fui, a shrine to lost causes concealing living frauds. "Nice setup," I said. "Symbolism so thick you could sell tickets." He frowned. "Archie, your description is sloppy. Did you note the safe's manufacturer, the dial, the combination system?" "I was busy not being tossed out on my ear," I said. "Sorry I didn't pause to sketch blueprints." His scowl deepened. "You must discipline your faculties. An observation unrecorded is a clue lost. Without details, we are crippled." That lit me up. "Listen, if you wanted a draftsman, you should have hired one. I got you the who, the where, and the what. If that's sloppy, maybe you'd like to infiltrate a gentleman's club yourself. I'll buy you a silk cravat." The orchids trembled in the silence that followed. Horseman wisely made himself scarce, retreating down the rows. Wolfe's lips compressed, then slowly eased. "Your impertinence is noted, but your facts, such as they are, will suffice. Sit." I perched on a stool. Wolfe waddled to a bench, lowered his bulk, and began his lecture tone, which was as unavoidable as sunrise. "The South, Archie, is an edifice built on wealth, honour, and illusion. Dynasties like the Ashfords cling to rituals, to magnolia blossoms and portraits, while their coffers bleed. A ledger, hidden, becomes both sword and shield. If it contains proof of embezzlement or of illegitimacy in bloodlines, it would unseat heirs and expose thieves." "Neat package," I said. "Money plus scandal equals murder." "Exactly." Wolfe's eyes half closed. Bryce discovered too much, hence his silence. Gerald, reckless but useful as a decoy, rants about inheritance yet presents an alibi. Eugenia, regal, urges concealment. Caroline, the innocent, is painted unstable. It is a pattern. The guilty conspire, the honest are destroyed. "Sounds like family," he grunted. "Do not jest. Now, the burned note. You preserved half?" "Of course," I said. "It's filed in the safe." "Pfui, half is insufficient. The fibres must be analysed. Only then can we know whether the fire was incidental or contrived. Send Panzer." I raised a brow. "Saul? What's he supposed to do? Sniff ashes like a bloodhound?" "Saul Panzer is meticulous," Wolfe intoned. "He will trace the origin of the paper, the ribbon imprint, perhaps the machine itself. Such fibres sing louder than witnesses." "Fine," I said. "I'll give him the singed scrap and let him do his choir practice." I swung by the St. Regis incinerator on my way out. Too late. The chute had been emptied at dawn. When I reported back, Wolfe only said, "Then the ledger itself must replace the missing sheet. We will have the book speak for the ash." We sat in silence for a moment, the orchids swaying like conspirators. Then Wolfe stirred again. "Archie, we must apply pressure. Inspector Kramer will bluster, but he has one virtue. He is incorruptible. Through him, we may force the Ashford's hand. You will feed him enough to agitate, but not enough to relieve." "You want me to tickle the bull but not calm him down," I said. "That'll be a fun chat." "Do it." And Archie. Wolfe fixed me with a stare that pinned me like a moth. "Do not underestimate Eugenia Ashford. That woman would poison a city to preserve her family's illusion. She will kill again if cornered." The air felt heavier, and not from the orchids. I stood, stretching. "All right. Saul gets the ashes, Kramer gets indigestion, and I get the bruises. You sure you don't want to take a stroll to the Magnolia Club yourself? I hear the portraits are inspiring." His glare was the ritual dismissal. Go, and be less sloppy. Back downstairs, I poured myself a glass of milk. Fritz passed through, tray in hand, eyebrow raised at the bruise still darkening on my cheek. I saluted him with the glass. Don't worry, Fritz, I'll live, but if Wolfe ever calls me sloppy again, I may not. The orchids rustled overhead, and Wolfe's voice floated faintly down. Pfui. That was closure enough. I was halfway through a glass of milk at 10:15 the next morning when the Gazette hit the stoop. Fritz had left it folded with military precision, headline up. I scooped it, glanced, and swore loud enough to startle the goldfish in the hall vase. "Wolfe!" I bellowed up the elevator shaft. "You'll want this." No answer, of course. Orchid hours, I muttered, carried the paper into the office and read the line again to be sure. Gerald Ashford dead. Poison suspected. The article sketched it neatly. Found slumped in his apartment at 1 a.m., whiskey glass on the nightstand, bottle on the counter. No forced entry. Medical examiner whispering cyanide. Caroline Ashford, mysteriously missing, now painted as prime suspect number 1 with her cousin gone to join Bryce in the obituary pages. At 11:02 the elevator sighed and Wolfe entered, still smelling faintly of orchids and fertilizer. He lowered into his chair, extending a hand. I passed him the Gazette. He read without expression, lips twitching only once. "Pfui," he said finally. "Two pat. 2 deaths, sequential, each casting suspicion on the same woman. It is a construction, not a sequence." I leaned back. "Tell that to Kramer. He'll be here in 5. Right on cue, the bell rang. Kramer stormed in, cigar already smoking like a verdict, like it was the last lifeboat on the Titanic. Stebbins trailed behind, carrying a file. "You bastard," Kramer growled. "You and your damn heiress. First her lawyer, now her cousin, both dead, both tied to her. Where is she?" "Invisible," Wolfe replied coolly. "Which is precisely the point. She is the phantom scapegoat, Inspector. Convenient, disposable, absent. Your true culprit manipulates her absence as a stage device." "Stage device, hell!" Kramer slammed the paper on the desk. "She poisoned him. Cyanide in his whiskey, open and shut." "Open, perhaps," Wolfe said, "but not shut. Who benefits by his death? Not Caroline, who inherits nothing while branded a murderess. The beneficiaries are those who require her discredited. Namely," Kramer cut him off, "save it for the DA. I've got warrants to file. If you're shielding her, I'll haul you both in." I piped up. "Inspector, if Caroline's such a criminal genius, why leave the bottle on the counter with fingerprints? Why not stage a robbery? Why not vanish after the first murder instead of calling Wolfe in tears? It smells—" "Like cyanide," Kramer roared. Wolfe lifted a hand, silencing us both. "Archie, report." I did, from the Gazette's sketch to Lon Cohen's whisper that Gerald's apartment looked staged. "And one more nugget," I added. In his desk they found a torn page. Ledger size, blank on one side, numbers on the other. Police think it's just bookkeeping, but my money says it was ripped from the Ashford ledger. That got Wolfe's brows arching. "Indeed, the phantom takes corporeal form. A page torn out. Why? To conceal an entry, or to flaunt a warning? And left in his desk, conveniently discovered by police. Again, 2 pat." Stebbins grunted. "You think somebody planted it?" "Exactly," Wolfe said. "An unsubtle attempt to substantiate the myth. Inspector, the hand that killed Bryce is the same that poisoned Gerald. Each act frames Caroline, yet she remains absent. Therefore, I don't give a damn," Kramer exploded. "I've got the DA breathing down my neck, 2 corpses and a missing heiress. Don't preach at me about myths. Produce her, Wolfe, or I'll put you in a cell till you do." Wolfe's eyes narrowed. "You dare!" I jumped in before the office turned into Gettysburg. "Inspector, give us 48 hours. If Caroline's guilty, we'll hand her to you ourselves. If not, you'll thank Wolfe for saving you from looking like a sap in front of the DA." Kramer glared, cigar trembling. Then he snapped his fingers at Stebbins. "Come on, leave these 2 in their ivory tower. But if I don't have her in 2 days, Wolfe, you're done." The door slammed, rattling the orchids in their glass cases upstairs. Wolfe exhaled heavily. "Archie, 2 deaths, both adorned with symbols. The silver letter opener, the poisoned whiskey. Both tied with ribbons to Caroline. It reeks of artifice. Someone paints her as villain to cloak their own malfeasance." "Sure," I said. "But the city doesn't care about artifice. The morning headline already decided she's guilty. You'll have to fight not just Kramer, but the Gazette. He reached for the bell cord, tugged. Fritz appeared with the beer tray, silent, efficient. Wolfe sipped, eyes closed. We must strip illusion, he murmured. Saul will continue with the paper fibers. You will return to Gerald's apartment, secure the torn page, examine everything. Perhaps the poison itself will speak. Fine, I said. But if cyanide starts speaking, I'll let it talk to you. He ignored me, setting the glass down with solemn finality. Archie, we hunt not Caroline, but the phantom who hides behind her. Find the page, then we will tear away the mask. That was his ritual closure. Beer drained, command issued, silence returned. I finished my milk, grimaced at the sour taste, and muttered, Some phantom. Whoever it is, they sure know how to use a woman's reputation as cover. If I don't watch it, I'll be next. Wolfe didn't open his eyes. Phooey, be less dramatic. Go. At 9 o'clock sharp, Saul Panzer showed up at the brownstone. I tried prying the torn page out of property at Centre Street. No dice, he said. Bagged, tagged, and married to a chain of custody. If Saul ever arrived late, I'd assume the earth had tilted. He took off his flat cap, nodded at me, and handed Wolfe a manila envelope as if it were a birth certificate. The burned scrap, Saul said. I traced the fibre. Cheap bond distributed by a stationery wholesaler in Lower Manhattan. But the typing, accounting figures, clear columns. Whoever typed it used a royal machine with a worn ribbon. There are faint impressions of dollar signs on the margin. Wolfe slit the envelope with his thumb, extracted the paper with tweezers and grunted. Yes, figures. Entries in a ledger. So the phantom has flesh. I leaned against the desk. That's great, but unless we want to prosecute a stationery dealer, we're still up a creek. Gerald's dead, Caroline's missing, and Kramer's veins are about to pop. Wolfe ignored me, turning to Saul. Thank you. You will receive your fee. Go. Saul tipped his cap and left without fuss, which is why Wolfe trusted him. When the elevator door shut, Wolfe shifted his bulk in the chair. Archie, the ledger is real, and it is in the Magnolia Club's safe. Sure, I said. All we need is Robert E. Lee's blessing and a stethoscope. Want me to march in the front door, or should I try rappelling down the chimney? You will go tonight, Wolfe said flatly. You will enter the lounge. You will open the safe under my instruction by telephone. Then you will bring me the ledger. I stared. Wolfe, cracking a safe in a gentleman's club isn't just risky, it's suicidal. If they catch me, I'll be stuffed and mounted between the deer heads. Phooey, you will not be caught. You have competence, and I shall guide you. Report back at midnight. That was Wolfe for you, calm as a Buddha, sending me to juggle dynamite. At 11:30 that night, I stood in the Magnolia Club lounge, phone receiver cradled between ear and shoulder, whispering like a burglar in a sermon. The place was empty except for portraits, shadows, and the faint tick of a grandfather clock. Saul had the night porter chasing a phantom service call in the basement, which bought me 5 quiet minutes and a clear shot at Robert E. Lee. Wolfe's voice rumbled in my ear from the brownstone. Describe the safe. Steel, chest high, combination dial. Up close I can read the badge this time. Die bold. Excellent. Now, place your hand on the dial. Left to 24, same first stop the treasurer used, I obeyed. Heart thumping. If anyone walked in, I'd be explaining myself with fists. Now right to 79, then left to 13. The tumblers clicked, the sound sharp in the stillness. I swallowed. It's open. Proceed, Wolfe instructed. I swung the heavy door. Inside was a single volume, black leather, thick, edges gilt. The Ashford Ledger. I lifted it reverently, half expecting lightning. Well, Wolfe demanded. It's a book, I whispered, but not the kind you read before bed. Bring it at once. Back at the brownstone at 12:42, I set the ledger on Wolfe's desk like an offering. He leaned forward, eyes gleaming. Fritz had left a tray of cold chicken and bread untouched. Wolfe ignored food for once, which told me how serious this was. He opened the ledger. Pages thick, ink dark, columns neat. Shipping accounts, cotton deals, real estate transfers. 10 years of Ashford history. But in the margins were notes, tiny, spidery handwriting. Embezzlement, Wolfe breathed. See here. Funds diverted through shell accounts. Half the family implicated. Gerald, yes, but also Eugenia. But Caroline. He flipped pages. Her share untouched. Her entries clean. She alone stands uncorrupted. Which makes her, I said, the heir with both the money and the moral high ground. Exactly. Wolfe tapped a margin note. And see, the handwriting. Eugenia Ashford herself. She kept the ledger, annotated the thefts. The matriarch recorded every fraud, perhaps to preserve control. This is her noose. I whistled low. So the grand lady who called Caroline unstable is the one dipping into the pot. Neat. Neat? Wolfe's voice rose. It is monstrous and predictable. Dynasties collapse from within, undone by their own custodians. I leaned back, arms folded. So now what? Hand the ledger to Kramer. He'll choke on the figures before he admits you beat him to it. Wolfe's eyes glinted. We shall use Kramer. He is incorruptible but malleable. We will present enough to force his hand, but only when all are gathered. Until then, conceal this. He slid the ledger into the office safe with a grunt, spun the dial, and sat back. Archie, prepare a memorandum, exact entries. Eugenia's handwriting, Gerald's diversions, Caroline's innocence. Leave nothing ambiguous. I rolled a fresh sheet into the typewriter. You know, I risked my neck for that book. If anyone asks how we got it, I'd like a footnote saying, Goodwin cracked the safe while Wolfe cracked walnuts. Phooey, Wolfe muttered. Type. So I did, the keys clattering into the early hours while Wolfe sipped his midnight beer. Each entry I copied was another nail in Eugenia's coffin. By 2 a.m. my eyes burned, but the report was done. I stacked it neatly, poured myself one last glass of milk, and leaned back. Wolfe closed his eyes, satisfied. Archie, we have the truth. Now we must wield it. That was his ritual closure. Orchids by day, ledgers by night, and me doing the legwork while he planned the trap. I raised my glass. To Eugenia Ashford, may she choke on her own numbers. Wolfe grunted. The orchids overhead seemed to whisper agreement. It was 3:15 in the afternoon when I pulled up to Eugenia Ashford's Manhattan mansion, a block of stone and iron that looked like it had been transplanted straight from Charleston, humidity and all. The place had shutters tall enough to slap a horse and a brass knocker shaped like a magnolia bloom, just in case you missed the theme. I rang, and a butler with a face like he'd been carved out of driftwood led me inside. The drawing room smelled of roses and old varnish. Mrs. Eugenia Ashford entered a moment later, gliding rather than walking, her black silk gown whispering against the carpet. Pearls draped her throat, and a lace shawl clung to her shoulders as if clinging for dear life. She carried a silver tray with 2 glasses and a tall pitcher. "Mr. Goodwin," she said in a voice dipped in molasses. I had hoped Nero Wolfe would come himself, but I suppose orchids outrank widows. "That's his way," I said, settling onto a damask chair that felt like it might collapse under the strain. When danger calls, Wolfe sends me. I'm younger, sprier, and more expendable. She smiled faintly, pouring amber liquid into the glasses. Sweet tea, a family recipe. I accepted the glass, but only sniffed. It smelled fine, but so did Bryce's champagne before he wound up ventilated with a silver letter opener. We talked. She played the frail widow, hands fluttering like moths as she spoke of her grief. Gerald's death, Bryce's murder, Caroline's delusions. According to her, Caroline had always been fragile, prey to nervous fancies, unable to carry the burden of the family trust. "She is not fit, Mr. Goodwin," Eugenia murmured, her eyes damp but sharp beneath the veil. Gerald was reckless, yes, but he understood responsibility. Caroline, poor child, imagines threats where none exist. That was the red herring, delivered with magnolia grace. I let her run with it, sipping nothing from my glass. Then came the slip. "Such a shame about Mr. Bryce," she said, gaze steady. "Stabbed in his chest at precisely 10:45. I was at the club at that hour, surrounded by witnesses. The Gazette hadn't printed an exact time, so her minute mark rang like a bell, only cops and killers here." Such a tragic coincidence. I nearly dropped my glass. 10:45, you say?" "Yes." She dabbed her eyes with a lace handkerchief. But the newspapers hadn't printed a time. Only the police and the killer would know it. She realized her mistake a beat too late, covering with a cough. "To the minute, huh?" I said lightly. "You must keep a better watch than the metronome clock." Her lips pressed tight. "Mr. Goodwin, surely you don't suspect—" I stood. "I suspect everybody until Wolfe tells me not to." Thanks for the tea. Do drink, she urged, pushing the glass forward. Later, I said. I'm saving my poison quota for bourbon. Her eyes hardened, just for a flicker, but it was enough. The genteel mask slipped and I glimpsed the venom underneath. I left the glass untouched, nodded to the driftwood butler, and stepped back into the rain. Back at the brownstone at 5:05, Wolfe listened from his chair while I laid it out. The pearls, the shawl, the sweet tea, the slip about Bryce's exact time of death. When I finished, Wolfe's eyes narrowed to slits. She knows too much. She has cornered Archie, and therefore most dangerous. You were correct not to drink. Poison has ever been the weapon of those who smile while they kill. Yeah, I said, rubbing the back of my neck. She almost had me pegged as the main course. Lucky for me, I prefer milk. He tugged the bell cord. Fritz entered with the evening tray, glasses of beer, a platter of cheese. Wolfe accepted his with a sigh, then spoke again. Beware, Archie. Eugenia Ashford will not yield gracefully. She has tasted power for decades, and now the ledger threatens to unmask her. She will invent phantoms, a Charleston enforcer perhaps, to deflect suspicion. Do not be deceived, the venom is hers. I poured myself a tall glass of milk, raised it in salute, and said, Here's to widows with sharp tongues and sharper arsenals. If she's planning another family dinner, remind me to decline. Wolfe grunted, which in his language meant agreement. The orchids rustled overhead, and the evening shadows pressed in, carrying with them the scent of roses and poison. It was nearing 8 in the evening, a time when most respectable New Yorkers were tucking into dinner, and I was ankle-deep in boarding-house dust instead. You wouldn't have pegged the place for harbouring a runaway heiress. The boarding-house sat on a quiet side street off Lexington, squeezed between a tailor shop and a half-dead bakery. Its clapboard paint peeled like sunburn, and the front stoop sagged in a way that said, nobody cared if gravity won. I'd been chasing shadows all afternoon, chasing Saul Panzer's hunch that Caroline Ashford hadn't fled far, but just low. He'd dropped the name of a Mrs. Hubbard's boarding house, discreet but cheap, the kind of place where secrets and unpaid rent went hand in hand. So, I went fishing. Inside, the hall smelled of boiled cabbage and damp shoes. A piano wheezed from the parlour, though whether from music or asthma was debatable. The landlady, Mrs. Hubbard herself, looked like she'd stepped out of a Dickens novel, apron dusted with flour, hair yanked into a bun that could break glass. Evening, I said, leaning on the counter. I'm looking for a friend. Southern accent, pearls tucked away in her suitcase. Calls herself Caroline, she sniffed. No Carolines here. Funny, I said, sliding a folded bill across the wood, because I heard you've got a new lodger named Miss Kent. Came in last night trembling like a rabbit. Her eyes flickered to the stairs. 3rd floor, end of the hall. But mind you, mister, she pays regular. I tipped my hat and climbed. At the top, I knocked lightly. A pause, then the scrape of a chair. The door cracked open and there she was, Caroline Ashford, minus the pearls and velvet. She wore a plain dress, hair pulled back, eyes wide and haunted. She looked smaller, younger, as though Manhattan had stripped her southern grandeur and left the raw nerve. Mr. Goodwin, she whispered, you shouldn't be here. It isn't safe. Lady, if I had a nickel for every time I've heard that line, Wolfe could retire in Tahiti. I slipped inside before she could argue. The room was modest, iron bed, battered dresser, wallpaper peeling in vines. On the dresser sat a half-packed suitcase, stockings draped over the edge like surrender flags. I didn't do it, she blurted, clutching her shawl. Not Bryce, not Gerald, you must believe me. Whether I believe you or not is small potatoes, I said, shutting the door. The cops believe you did, and that's enough to hang your portrait in the Hall of Infamy. Wolfe sent me to collect facts, not fairy tales, so start talking. She sank onto the bed, twisting her hands. It's Eugenia. She wants me gone. She's the one pulling the strings. Nathaniel Bryce discovered it. He said the trust was bleeding, that money was siphoned. He meant to confront her. That's why he's dead. Gerald was reckless, but even he didn't deserve to be poisoned. Her voice cracked, but underneath the tremble was steel. The hunted heiress was finding her backbone. Slow down, I said. You're claiming Bryce was about to expose Eugenia's embezzlement. That's convenient. Got proof? Her eyes darted. The ledger. It shows everything. But you already know that, don't you? Bryce told me he'd seen the margins. Eugenia's own handwriting. That pulled me up short. She hadn't been told about our safe-cracking stunt at the Magnolia Club, yet here she was, confirming the very detail Wolfe had under lock and key. "All right," I said. "Pack your suitcase. Wolfe wants a word, and if you try bolting, remember I've got longer legs." Back at the brownstone at 9:32, I ushered Caroline into the office. Wolfe was waiting, huge behind his desk, the ledger at his elbow. Fritz had set a tray of sandwiches untouched. Wolfe motioned Caroline to the red leather chair, gesturing with imperial calm. "Miss Ashford," he intoned, "this establishment functions only on truth. Lie once and I will cease to act. Do you understand?" She nodded quickly, eyes wide. "Good. Now, did you kill Nathaniel Bryce?" "No." "Did you poison Gerald Ashford?" "No." "Do you know who did?" She hesitated, then shook her head. "Only that Eugenia. She has the reach. She's feared in Charleston. People do what she tells them." Wolfe's nostrils flared. "Inadequate. You will give me facts, not impressions." Caroline trembled, then steadied. "Mr. Bryce told me 2 nights before his death that the ledger proved Eugenia had diverted funds, millions, from the trust into shell accounts. He said Gerald knew but didn't care as long as he could gamble his share. Bryce intended to reveal it at the next board meeting. He never had the chance." Wolfe leaned forward, tapping the ledger. "This volume corroborates your statement. The handwriting is Eugenia's. You, Miss Ashford, are the sole heir untouched by theft. Do you know why?" Her lips pressed tight. "My father. He insisted my share remain in bonds. He distrusted Eugenia's schemes." "Indeed," Wolfe murmured. "And now Eugenia would erase you to preserve her dominion. Phooey." I cut in. "Caroline, there's one hitch. You ran. That makes you look guilty. You've got Kramer seeing gallows. Why bolt?" Tears welled, but her chin lifted. "Because I knew they would blame me. I found a note under my hotel door. It said, 'The ledger seals your fate.' I panicked. I fled. I thought if I hid, perhaps—" "Perhaps," Wolfe said coldly, "you would live. But flight is futile. The phantom pursues. Miss Ashford, hear me. If you withhold again, if you lie or obscure or indulge in melodrama, I will abandon you. Do not trifle." She swallowed. "I swear, Mr. Wolfe, that is all I know." Silence filled the room, heavy as lead. Then Wolfe rang the bell. Fritz appeared with beer and milk. Wolfe took his glass, studied Caroline as though she were another exotic orchid, and spoke with finality. "You are our client. Archie will protect you. The truth is our only weapon. Without it, we are lost." I raised my milk. "To truth. May it show up before Kramer does with handcuffs." Wolfe closed his eyes, sipping. Caroline clutched her shawl tighter, but in her eyes the steel flickered again. It was 10:04 the next morning, and I was halfway through typing Wolfe's latest dictation when the phone rang. Wolfe was upstairs among the orchids, so I took it, the receiver warm in my hand. "Goodwin," I said. "Archie, Lon Cohen here." The Gazette man's voice was brisk, but I could hear the caffeine under it. "Word is the Ashford mess is crawling all over your lap. Heiress on the run, 2 corpses in the family ledger. What gives?" "Lon," I said, leaning back, "if I answered every fishing call you made, I'd be selling you trout. You'll have to cast elsewhere." "Come on," he pressed. "The Gazette doesn't run blind. The ledger, capital L, isn't just a rumour. We heard whispers of embezzlement, inheritance, the works. Either you give me a bone or I start gnawing at Wolfe's ankles in print." That was Lon, persistent as a tax collector. I told him to hold and buzzed the plant rooms. Wolfe's voice floated down, annoyed at the interruption. "Yes?" "It's Cohen," I said. "Wants gossip for the Gazette. I can hang up or you can milk him." "Milk him," Wolfe growled, "at once." So I passed the phone upstairs. 10 minutes later, Wolfe descended, bulk rolling off the elevator like a battleship. His expression was serene, which meant he'd just turned Cohen into a marionette. "Archie," he said, "prepare to witness the art of leverage. I have fed Cohen precisely enough to stimulate an appetite. The afternoon edition of the Gazette will carry hints, innuendo of Ashford embezzlement, whispers of poisoned chalices, the faint aroma of magnolia corruption. Eugenia Ashford will choke on her breakfast." "Great," I said, "but when she chokes, she'll cough straight into Kramer's ear." Precisely, Wolfe said with satisfaction. By noon, Fritz laid out lunch. Lamb stew, fresh rolls, cucumber salad. Wolfe ate with imperial detachment while I cleaned up the crumbs and wondered how long until the fireworks. I didn't have to wait long. At 1:47 sharp, the doorbell clanged like an alarm. I opened it to find Inspector Kramer, cigar blazing, face the colour of boiled beet. He stormed in without waiting. "Wolfe!" he bellowed, barging into the office. "You conniving son of a—" "Inspector," Wolfe said mildly, dabbing his lips with a napkin. "You arrive with such vigour, yet you intrude upon my digestion. Phooey." Kramer slammed a copy of the Gazette onto the desk. This garbage. Embezzlement, poisoned whiskey, Southern dynasties. Where do you think Cohen got it? You've been spoon-feeding him to twist the investigation." Wolfe merely arched his brows. "I provide perspective, Inspector. The Gazette reflects public opinion. Public opinion exerts pressure. Pressure compels the guilty to err. Thus, the investigation advances." "You're manipulating headlines," Kramer shouted, smoke curling from his cigar. "Do you want me tossed off the case? The DA's livid. He thinks I leaked it. You will," Wolfe cut in smoothly. "Use the Gazette as I do. A lever. You resent it, but you cannot prevent it. Publicity forces hands that subpoenas cannot." Kramer's glare could have melted steel. "If Caroline Ashford slips the net because of you, Caroline Ashford," Wolfe thundered suddenly, "is not the killer. Each corpse, each contrivance frames her. Too neat, too facile. You, Inspector, are not a fool. Do not allow yourself to be painted as one." For a second, silence. Then Kramer ground his cigar into the ashtray like he was killing a snake. "You'd better be right, Wolfe. If you're wrong, I'll drag you down with her." He stormed out, slamming the door. I whistled low. "There goes your best friend." "Phooey," Wolfe muttered, settling back into his chair. "He will return. He always does." At 3:05 the phone rang again. This time Saul Pantzer's steady voice came through. "Got something, Archie. Poison purchase records. Small apothecary down on Houston. Cyanide bought last week in cash. Clark remembered. The buyer wasn't Eugenia, but her personal maid. Description matches." "That's tidy," I said. "Too tidy." Saul grunted. "I'll keep digging." I relayed it to Wolfe. His eyes glittered. "Excellent. The maid acting as proxy. Of course Eugenia would not soil her hands. She commands, others procure." "Maybe," I said. "But Clark's can be bribed, memories bent. Could be a plant." "Or a red herring," Wolfe conceded. "Yet a significant one. Saul will pursue." The evening brought drizzle and neon reflections. At 7:12 Saul phoned again, this time with a hitch in his voice. "She's gone, Archie," he said. "The maid. Packed her trunk and vanished. No trace, no trail. Landlady swears she left in the night." I swore. Perfect. The one link we had, evaporated like gin in July. Back in the office, Wolfe sat rigid, beer untouched. As expected, the moment the Gazette whispered, the conspirators tightened their circle. The maid was either silenced or spirited away. Either way, Eugenia grows desperate. "And Kramer grows homicidal," I added. "Indeed." Wolfe's eyes closed. "We now wield two weapons, the ledger and the press. Tomorrow, Archie, we set the stage, summon them all, the matriarch, the missing heiress, the law. We shall end this performance." I poured myself a tall glass of milk, clinked it against his untouched beer, and said, "Here's to tomorrow's performance. Let's hope the audience doesn't shoot the orchestra." Wolfe grunted, eyes still shut. The orchids upstairs swayed in the draught, as though nodding agreement. It was the following evening at precisely 8:00 p.m. when the bell rang. Not the polite kind either. This was the clang of war, the brass knocker of fate. Wolfe, seated squarely behind his desk, nodded for me to answer. He was already dressed for the theatre, by which I mean he wore the same brown suit, yellow shirt, and grey tie he always wore when staging these living-room dramas. Fritz had lit the lamps, and the room carried that mix of beeswax, leather, and nerves that only comes when you invite a murderer to cocktails. I opened the door. First in line was Inspector Kramer, bulldozing his way through like he owned the joint. His cigar smoked like a fuse, his jaw was granite, and behind him lumbered Pearly Stebbins, ready to crack skulls if the inspector so much as sneezed. "Goodwin," Kramer growled. "This had better not be a circus." "Oh, it's a circus," I said. "But you've got front-row seats." Next came Eugenia Ashford, regal in black silk, her pearls gleaming, her face a marble mask. Behind her trailed two family retainers who looked like they'd been born polishing silver. Caroline followed, eyes wide but chin high, dressed plainly but with more dignity than the matriarch. And in the rear came Nathaniel Bryce's partners, summoned as witnesses to the trust affairs, though their presence was largely for colour. They filed into the office, and Wolfe gestured with imperial calm. "Be seated." The red leather chairs groaned under Southern heritage and Northern suspicion alike. Fritz appeared silently, set a tray of glasses and water, and withdrew. No wine, no food. This was judgment, not dinner. Wolfe steepled his fingers. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice rolling like cathedral bells, "we are gathered to end a charade. 2 men are dead, Nathaniel Bryce by the blade, Gerald Ashford by poison. Both deaths convenient, both draped in the suggestion of guilt upon Miss Caroline Ashford. Phooey, it is a fabrication." Kramer snorted. "Get to the point, Wolfe." "I am at the point, Inspector. The truth lies in arithmetic, not melodrama. The Ashford ledger, concealed in the Magnolia Club's vault, records 10 years of embezzlement. Gerald diverted funds for gambling. Others partook. But the architect, the keeper of the false accounts, was none other than Mrs. Eugenia Ashford." Eugenia's pearls rattled faintly. "How dare you?" "Dare?" Wolfe's voice sharpened. "I do not dare, madam. I present. Here." He tapped the black ledger, now resting on his desk like a holy relic. "Margin notes in your hand, ink unmistakable, recording each diversion. You wrote them to preserve control. Bryce discovered this. You silenced him with a blade adorned by your family crest. Gerald then sought to blackmail you, waving the threat of exposure. You silenced him too, with poison procured by your maid who has since vanished." Kramer's eyes narrowed. "That true, Wolfe? You got proof?" "Proof sufficient to satisfy even you, Inspector," Wolfe said dryly. "Your men have the apothecary's poison ledger showing a cash cyanide sale to Mrs. Ashford's maid, and her trunk bears the vial's circular indent under the lining. Observe the handwriting. Consider the timing. Most damning of all, the threatening note signed only the ledger. Who but the keeper of the book would use it as weapon and signature?" All eyes turned to Eugenia. She sat rigid, fingers tightening on her gloves. "That is absurd," she said coolly. "Caroline is unstable. She concocts fantasies. I merely sought to protect the family." Caroline rose, trembling but strong. "No, Aunt Eugenia. You sought to protect yourself." "Sit," Wolfe commanded, and she obeyed. He leaned forward, bulk like a mountain about to move. "Madam, you are accustomed to command. You believed you could command truth itself, but tonight truth commands you." He let the silence stretch, then softly, almost gently. "Why, when you wrote the notes, did you choose to sign them as the ledger, rather than merely threaten anonymously?" Eugenia sniffed. Because the ledger was—" The room froze. She realized too late. Her lips clamped shut, but the slip hung in the air like smoke. Kramer surged forward, slamming his palm on the desk. "That's it. You admitted it. You wrote those notes." Stebbins was already on his feet, pulling handcuffs from his pocket. Eugenia's mask cracked. The regal facade collapsed into fury. "This is an outrage. You'll regret this, all of you. I did it for the family, for honor." "Honor?" Wolfe thundered. "Phooey! You murdered to cloak your thefts. You smeared an innocent girl to preserve your illusions. That is not honor. That is corruption with magnolia perfume." Kramer snapped the cuffs onto her wrists. She struggled, pearls breaking and scattering across the rug like tiny bones. Caroline gasped, covering her mouth. "You can't prove it," Eugenia shrieked. "You think a slip of the tongue." But Wolfe was already closing the ledger with a final thud. "We have more than a slip. We have the book, the handwriting, the vanished maid, and now your confession of authorship. Inspector, take her." Kramer shoved her towards Stebbins. "Gladly." As they hauled her out, Eugenia's voice echoed down the hall, still railing about honor and family. The door slammed, leaving silence. "And have your men note," Wolfe added dryly, "the cheap champagne at the St. Regis was ordered after Mr. Bryce was dead. Theatre, Inspector, nothing more." Caroline sat, trembling, tears slipping down her cheeks. Wolfe regarded her with something almost like sympathy. "You are free, Miss Ashford. Your father would be gratified." She whispered, "Thank you." Wolfe closed his eyes, tugged the bell cord. Fritz entered with the evening tray. Beer for Wolfe, milk for me. Wolfe raised his glass. "Justice," he intoned, "is not magnolia blossoms, but truth." I raised my milk. "And the truth is, Wolfe, you're one hell of a showman. Curtain down." The orchids upstairs swayed in their glass houses, and for once the brownstone felt like the only honest refuge in a city of masks. The brownstone always feels different after a case breaks. The air clears, the shadows settle, the city outside remembers it has somewhere else to be. But inside, Wolfe insists on routine. Orchids at 4, dinner at 8, beer at 9, bed at 11. That evening was no different, except for the fact that an empire had just collapsed in our office. Caroline Ashford sat across from me, pale but steady, her hands clasped in her lap. She had been cleared, vindicated by Wolfe's performance, and Eugenia was now a guest of the state. Still, freedom is a bitter draught when it comes with the taste of family blood. "I don't know how to thank you," she said softly, her southern drawl like the last note of a violin. "Everything I was taught, our name, our honour, has been turned to ash, and yet, because of you, I still breathe." "Because of Wolfe," I corrected. "I just do the running and bleeding. He does the soliloquies." She smiled faintly, but her eyes darted to the ledger on Wolfe's desk, now locked in our safe. "That book, it will follow me, won't it? Every dollar, every sin. My inheritance isn't fortune, it's poison." Before I could answer, the bell rang at 8:32. Fritz went to the door and returned with Inspector Kramer. The inspector stomped in, cigar wedged tight, eyes bloodshot. He looked like he'd spent the last 3 hours arm wrestling the DA. "Wolfe," he barked, "you pulled it off. Eugenia's booked. Arraignment tomorrow. DA's chewing nails but admits you saved his hide. Don't expect me to send flowers." Wolfe, enthroned behind his desk, inclined his head. "Nor would I want them. Sit, Inspector." Kramer sat, still glowering. "You and your damn headlines. The Gazette's already screaming Magnolia Widow falls. You turned this into a morality play." "Truth must be staged," Wolfe said calmly. "Otherwise the guilty dance free." Kramer puffed. "Fine. You get your headlines. But don't think I'll ever say thank you." "Then don't," I said cheerfully. "Just stop chewing the furniture." That earned me a glare, but I'd had worse. The next morning, Caroline returned. She wore grey, plain but dignified, and in her hands she carried a pot wrapped in burlap, a rosebush, spindly but alive, with buds the colour of blush wine. "This was my father's," she said, placing it on the desk. "He tended it on our Charleston veranda. It survived storms, drought, neglect. I thought, perhaps, you might keep it, Mr. Wolfe, as thanks." Wolfe looked at the plant as though she had offered him a raccoon, his lips compressed. "Madam," he said, "I accept only in coin. Sentiment clutters as surely as debt. Your fee, however, was sufficient." Her cheeks flushed, but she nodded. "As you wish." "Indeed," Wolfe said. "Wealth, Miss Ashford, is an affliction as potent as poison. Handle it with gloves, or it will stain you as it stained your aunt." She swallowed, then rose. "I will remember." When she left, Fritz carried the rosebush to the kitchen. Wolfe leaned back, exhaled. "Archie, the human capacity to romanticize affliction is endless. Fui." "Maybe," I said, pouring myself milk. "But a rose on the veranda beats a ledger in the safe." He grunted, eyes drifting closed. Orchids awaited him, their petals more reliable than heirs or fortunes. And that's how the case of the Heiress of Charleston ended. Not with a fortune gained, but with a flower spurned. Wolfe to his orchids, me to my typewriter, and justice scribbled in ink between ledgers and roses.